Hello and welcome to this how to paint a Khorne bloodletter painting guide. In this video I'm going to focus on how I did the skin as well as the non-metallic metal work on the blade and the hilt. I hope you enjoy it and let's get cracking. So I start off by priming the miniature black, followed by mixing Dirty Red and Tenebrous Grey from AK Interactive to get this nice dark red color as my base. And I just work around the miniature and paint everywhere where the skin's going to be red. Not too thick. If there's some places I don't feel the coverage is enough, then I do a second coat. I leave the places that are going to remain black, being the horns and that fin on the back, as well as the... And here we have the base coat completed, and we're going to work on from here. So our next step is to basically continue the previous mix, but we add a little bit more Dirty Red to build up that color. And what I do is I basically paint the whole of the skin, but I just leave the original color in the recesses. So I'm focusing everywhere except where there'll be really dark shadow, and also to differentiate the different muscle forms. And so we have the next stage done. As you can see, there's just a little bit of the previous color showing through. For the next stage, I just use a pure Dirty Red. And once again, I go over all the areas, but now I leave not only the original very dark shadow, but I leave a little bit more of the previous mix. So you're starting to get this transition from the super dark to a more kind of mid-tone. And here's the result, and you're starting to see a little bit of shadow building up and also a bit of definition around the muscles. So for this stage, I do a mix of 50% Dirty Red to 50% Matt Red. And then I focus where the light will start catching the miniature, as well as working on defining those individual muscle shapes, leaving the previous kind of colors in the recesses as we go along. And here we have the net effect, which is basically getting a little bit brighter. For the next stage, I use pure matte red and just kind of carrying on building up the saturation of the red. As you can see, this is quite a jump, so it's a little bit brighter and the skin's really starting to get a little bit of life in it. But as previously, you're just leaving the previous layer and just building up smaller and smaller areas. And this is what it looks like after the matte red's finished, so you're really starting to see that definition come through. For the next stage of the skin, I do a 50-50 matte red and deep red. And then once again, you're just doing smaller and smaller areas, and you're just kind of building up that brightness as you go along. I can appreciate this is a lot of steps, but as you do it, it gives a smooth blend and building up that color. And here this stage is finished, so you're starting to get a nice rich red appearing. So we're almost there. Now with this one, I just use a plain deep red and just kind of focusing on the places where I think the light will be catching the muscle forms at their kind of height, and really working on that definition, but not using a lot of paint and not covering a lot of area, just dotting as I go along and just trying to really reinforce that definition. And this is what the deep red stage will look like finished. Final stage of the red, I use Cadmium Red and Deep Red and kind of just pick out the highest points on the miniature, and as you can see, it's just a very little dot in each corner or on the knuckles, or as you saw me working there on the eyebrows, just to bring it out. And that's the red skin finished. So now I'm going to quickly talk through how I painted the tongue. So I started off with deep purple and Tenebrous Grey as a 50-50 kind of base coat, and then I added magenta to the mix and kind of worked it down to get a bit of a transition going. And then the second half of the tongue, so to the tip, is just pure magenta that is placed there, as you can see working through there. And then with the final highlight, I just added a little bit of vampire flesh to that original mix in order to just bring that tip of the tongue out. And then there's the tongue completed, so you have this nice transition starting at dark by the mouth, ending with this nice bright at the base. So now we're going to move on to painting the non-metallic steel's blade. So I start off with using neutral grey, and what I do is almost like a checkerboard design. So I started off at the tip there, and then right underneath it painted another bit of grey, and then I left a gap which is going to be the dark reflection, and then once again repeated the process in the middle, and then finally at the end. So you have this kind of 3 stages where there's a little bit of overlap. And this is what it looks like on both sides when completed. So for the next stage I use dark blue grey from Vallejo, and I basically paint halfway in between in the middle of the previous checkerboards. So what you're doing is you're leaving a bit of the neutral grey in the on either side, and then the dark blue grey makes up the middle portion. And this I repeat on the other side over here. So basically what you're doing is you're going to be making a whole lot of little lines, and eventually you'll have that non-metallic effect come through by the end of the process, hopefully. So for the next step I use Sky Grey, and I paint this just over the previous grey that we worked with, that deep blue grey. And so this is just a thin little line right in the middle. So this is the highest highlight of the swords. So I've got it on the tip, and then once again in each of those previous blocks I'm just drawing a little line down each of the centers. So you're starting to build up this gradient, which will then blend as we go along. And so after the first three stages, this is what the sword looks like. So now I'm going to paint the dark areas of the sword, and in this I use the AK Interactive Tenebrous Grey, which I've used before. It's almost a purpley grey, which I think works quite well for this effect. So now the four colors I used for the sword have been all blocked in, and now we're going to move to the blending. So for the first blend I use a combination of the Tenebrous Grey and the neutral grey, which gives you kind of a medium in between the two, and I work over a bit of the neutral grey that I painted previously and a bit over the Tenebrous Grey that was also painted previously. So you're starting to build up this slow transition between the different colors, and this is the end result which we have over here. So I felt the jump between the previous blend and the Tenebrous Grey was still too great, so here I did a little bit of neutral grey and a lot of the Tenebrous Grey to kind of give me that final blend between the original grey and the very darkest point. So I'm just trying to smooth it out. So as you're painting your non-metallic, what you're trying to do is that you're trying to get as smooth the gradients as possible between each step. And so you might find your original mixes were slightly darker or lighter, and you adjust accordingly. And so we're starting to get a smoother transition in the darker part of the sword. So for the next stage of blending, I take the dark blue and the neutral grey, and where these previous two colors joined, I then paint a little line in between them to smooth that transition. Once again, here you can see the transitions are starting to smooth between each color. So for the final transition, I mix Sky Grey with the dark blue grey, and I just work this on either side of the Sky Grey. As you can see, that transition is just starting to become a little bit softer and smoother between the colors. Once this was complete, then I just went back in with the Sky Grey and just made sure that those little lines were still sharp and bright. And there we have it. So the last thing I do after all the kind of colors are blended is I did a glaze of dark blue grey. So this is just very diluted, and I find this kind of just smooths all the transitions and brings the blade all together. You can see it there at the bottom. It's how thin it is. And there we have the smoothing effect of the glaze on the blade. Next I do an edge highlight along both edges and down the middle of the blade. This just brings the blade together where the final light would kind of hit it. Just take your time. I'm using the side of the brush here just to kind of pick out the hard edges, and it made it relatively easy, and then just paint slowly down the center of the blade. And this is what the final blade looks like. Now we're going to move on to painting the gold. So I start off with the undercoat of Red Hull from AK Interactive, and then I use the ivory and basically paint in where the brightest part of the gold is going to be. So this is really on the cross guard, down the middle, lining up with the blade, and on either side of the cross guard, really on those points, as well as the hilt on the blade on the top side. For the next stage, I use Sand Yellow from AK Interactive, and what I'm doing is basically painting right next to the ivory and blocking in this color. It's the same kind of principle I used on the sword, and we're going to then blend them as we go along. And this is what the finished effect will look like. So the next step, I use Sahara Yellow. Now Sahara Yellow is quite a translucent color, so a lot of the red hull shines through, and as I'm working, as you can see, it kind of almost just completes the effect for you, which I was a bit surprised. It's the first time I used this combination, but it really just brings out the gold so quickly, and it almost finishes the effect right there and then. And there you have the hilt kind of at this stage after the Sahara Yellow was applied. And for the final stage, I use a little bit of ice yellow just to pick out where I think there should be a little bit of extra light or contrast. It's important when painting non-metallic to have a big variety between the brightest and darkest colors. At this point, like with the sword, I just do a glaze of the Sahara yellow to kind of pull all the transitions together. So it's very thin, and I just paint it all over the gold, and this is the final result. Then I quickly paint the hilt by taking neutral grey and just dragging it along the top. So the next stage, I'm now working on the black areas, so I now paint over all of them with the Tenebrous grey from AK Interactive, leaving a little bit of the black spray coat in the recesses. For the first highlight, I take the Tenebrous grey and add a bit of neutral grey and just kind of focus on the top areas as well as on the horns. For the final highlight, I just work the tips of the sail on his back as well as kind of the edges of the horns. And then I finish off by doing the teeth and the claws with vampire flesh. Here's the end result. I'm pretty happy how it turned out. It took me about an hour and a half to complete. If you were doing it in batches, it'd probably be a lot quicker, as you'd have your paints already pre-mixed and you just go from one to the next. If you enjoyed this video or have any questions, leave a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see future videos that are coming soon. Cheers, bye.